For decades, the world has remembered John Lennon as the voice of peace, a revolutionary artist who dared to imagine a better world. But while millions saw the legend, very few saw the man quietly crumbling behind the scenes. Now, 44 years after his tragic and sudden death, the silence has finally been broken. At 92, Yoko Ono, the woman who loved him, lost him, and lived with the truth, has revealed something that has stunned even his closest fans. It turns out, John Lennon may have sensed his fate long before that fatal night. He had enemies, he had fears, and he had an eerie chance to escape it all. But he didn't. Why? What Yoko finally admitted will change how you see the final days of John Lennon forever. This is the story you were never told. Long before the world screamed his name, John Lennon was just a boy, and at the center of his world was his mother, Julia. They didn't live together, but their bond was undeniable. She was the first to place an instrument in his hands, a banjo, a ukulele, and gently opened his ears to the raw magic of early American rock and roll. It was Julia who lit the spark in him, the spark that would one day set the world on fire. But in 1958, tragedy struck. Julia was killed in a sudden accident. John was just 17. And in an instant, the light that had guided him was gone. The grief was unbearable, and it never fully left him. That loss carved something permanent into his soul. You can hear it in his music, the yearning, the ache, the loneliness between the lines. It didn't just shape him as a person. It defined him as an artist. And when he co-founded the Beatles just 2 years later, he wasn't just writing songs. He was pouring out everything he had carried since the day he lost his mother. John Lennon wasn't born a legend. He was shaped by pain, driven by passion, and haunted by memories that never faded. The majority of the Beatles' music was written by Lennon-McCartney, and McCartney's collaboration was based on Lennon's more introspective, raw edge. Lennon's style was direct and emotional, and he didn't shy away from uncomfortable topics. He sang about identity, confusion, and longing, even when wrapped in catchy melodies. His lyrics often asked difficult questions because he wasn't just writing songs to entertain, he was writing to express, process, and sometimes to provoke. As the Beatles' popularity grew, Lennon became known for both his music and his blunt personality. He wasn't afraid to criticize institutions or say what he thought, even if it got him in trouble. His interviews were often in the news, and his casual comments sometimes turned into international scandals. Sadly, this was the start of Lennon's exposure to threats and danger. By the late 1960s, Lennon had become a symbol of creativity and honesty for some and a symbol of rebellion and chaos for others. John Lennon was never one to try to please others, and he always pushed back against the idea that pop stars should be quiet and polite. This constant push against boundaries, comfort, and silence would shape his choices in music and his personal life in the years to come. While the world knew John Lennon as a Beatle and later as a cultural icon, few really understood the personal weight he carried from his early years. But John Lennon's story took a sharp turn. He met the woman who would completely change his life in an art gallery in London. John Lennon met Yoko Ono at the Indica Gallery in London in November 1966. It was an art show, and Ono, who was already a well-known avant-garde artist, was previewing a piece called Yes Painting. To see the piece properly, visitors had to climb a ladder and look through a magnifying glass to see the small word Yes written on the ceiling. For Lennon, it was more than just a date. The clever guy thought it was weird, but it was the sign in the gallery that caught his eye: hammer a nail in. Lennon asked Ono right away if he could really put a nail in, but she said no because the main exhibition was the next day. But after being persuaded, she agreed, and they had a conversation that started something very powerful. Their connection wasn't just based on shared interests, it was intense and emotional from the start. At the time, John Lennon was still married to Cynthia Powell. But that marriage had been falling apart for a long time. Yoko gave him something different with her: intellectual stimulation, creative freedom, and a deep sense of emotional closeness that Lennon hadn't found anywhere else. It wasn't long before they couldn't be apart. Their relationship quickly turned romantic, and by early 1968, Lennon had left Cynthia. The emotional connection between them was so strong that Lennon once said, "When I fell in love with Yoko, I knew, my God, this is different than anything I've." As Lennon and Ono got closer, tensions within the Beatles started to rise. Ono reportedly started going to recording sessions and often sitting quietly next to Lennon in the studio. Later reports showed that this upset the other Beatles, who saw it as a breach of the creative dynamic that had once thrived on privacy and shared focus. But Lennon didn't see it that way. He saw Yoko as not only his partner but also as his artistic equal in the studio. When the Beatles broke up, most fans and the media blamed Yoko Ono. They saw her as an outsider and an unconventional artist who had somehow gotten into the Beatles' world and upset the delicate balance within the band. She was Japanese, older than Lennon, and didn't want to fit in with public expectations, and that was enough for most people to blame her. Lennon once said that meeting Ono was like a young man meeting his first woman. You leave the guys at the bar, don't go play football anymore, and don't go to play snooker or billiards. Even though they loved each other very much and were very close, their relationship wasn't always smooth. One of the worst things that happened was at a party in New York City in 1972. The party was hosted by activist Jerry Rubin and happened around the time that President Richard Nixon was re-elected. Many of the guests were already feeling down because of the political climate, and Lennon started drinking heavily. At some point in the evening, he disappeared into a bedroom with another woman. Even worse, people trying to leave the party couldn't get their coats back because they were in the bedroom where Lennon was loudly and unrepentantly betraying Ono. As she sat there listening to everything, people tried to be quiet and not look at her, but the damage had already been done, both privately and publicly. The man who talked so much about love and peace had acted carelessly, and it left a deep wound that by 1973, the cracks were impossible to fix. Ono told Lennon that they needed space because their relationship had become tense, chaotic, and unhealthy in many ways. She suggested that he leave New York and spend some time apart. Lennon did what she said and moved to Los Angeles, starting what would become known as his Lost Weekend. This was a time of parties, chaos, and short-term distractions that lasted for almost 18 months. During this time, Lennon started dating May Pang, a personal assistant who had worked for both him and Ono, according to several sources. Pang's own Ono had basically agreed to the deal because she saw it as a less destructive alternative to total collapse. But while Lennon seemed to be free, he was actually falling apart in Los Angeles. His drinking got worse, he got into fights in public, and he was even arrested for heckling the Smothers Brothers during a comedy show. He still recorded music during this time, but his personal life was falling apart. Interviews from that time showed a man who was unsure of himself, insecure, and trying to get away. Finally, in 1974, something changed. Lennon started talking to Ono again. The conversations were shaky at first, but they became more regular over time. Despite everything, the emotional connection between them hadn't gone away, and in 1975, Lennon and Ono got back together. This time, things were different. Soon after they got back together, Ono got pregnant with their son Sean. Lennon was 35 years old at the time, and having a child marked a new phase in his life that he hadn't been through with his first wife. In order to be a better father to his first son Julian from a previous marriage, Lennon chose to step back from the spotlight. He stopped touring and cooking meals, changed diapers, and stayed home, which was unheard of for a man who had been famous for over a decade. During this time, his love for Ono grew. Their relationship, which had been full of ups and downs and constant attention, found a calmer rhythm, and he started to talk about her as more than just a muse or collaborator. As someone who had saved his life more than once by pushing him, walking away when needed, and being there for him when it mattered, this wasn't a fairy tale romance. It had its flaws, betrayals, and long silences, but it endured, and that endurance gave Lennon the stability he hadn't had in years. In the years before he died, Lennon often said he was happy not with fame or wealth, but with his role as a father, a partner, and a normal man trying to live a peaceful life. Lennon had to deal with more problems than just his relationship with Yoko. Throughout his life, he had to deal with the one thing that had followed him around, his own personal problems. John Lennon was the lead singer of the most famous band in the world. He was rich, adored, and widely seen as a genius. But even as millions of people screamed his name, he often felt like a drifting, uncertain man fighting demons most couldn't see. Lennon had a lot of self-doubt and depression. The highs of fame were fun, but they also came with a constant spotlight and crushing expectations. In interviews, he often talked about feeling trapped by his image. He was praised as a visionary but constantly picked apart and misunderstood. Fame didn't protect him from his emotional lows, in fact, it often made them worse. He had times when he felt disconnected from everything, including his music, the people around him, and even himself. In the early 1970s, Lennon became more politically active than ever. He was strongly against the Vietnam War and made his opposition public. He held bed-ins, a form of protest that required them to sit in bed for long periods of time, with Yoko Ono. They also went to anti-war rallies and used his fame to call out injustice wherever he saw it. But the U.S. government president took notice of his activism. Richard Nixon didn't see John Lennon as an artist, but as a threat. His anti-war views and ability to sway young voters put him on the radar of the FBI and the Immigration and Naturalization Service. In fact, from 1972 to 1975, Lennon was the target of a relentless campaign to have him deported from the United States. The Nixon administration thought that if they could silence Lennon and get him out of the country before the 1972 election, they could silence a voice that had become too loud. Lennon had made New York his home and was afraid of losing it all. His immigration status became a legal tug-of-war that went on for 3 years. During that time, Lennon couldn't relax, make plans for the future, or get away from the growing fear that he was being watched. Later documents showed that he wasn't imagining things, he was actually being watched, his phone was tapped and his movements were tracked. Fame had given him a platform, but it also made people a target on his back. As Lennon's fame grew, his personal habits started to get worse. He turned to drugs as a way to deal with anxiety, mood swings, and the overwhelming weight of fame. This habit wasn't as well known as some of his contemporaries, but it quietly took its toll on his relationships, clouded his judgment, and at times put more distance between him and those closest to him. Even before he became an activist, Lennon had sought controversy in 1966, when he said something that would follow him for the rest of his life. He would say for the rest of his life, Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink, we're more popular than Jesus now. The remark was meant to be a comment on how youth culture was changing in Britain, but it was completely taken out of context when it got to the US. The backlash was immediate and violent. Radio stations in the Bible Belt banned Beatles music, people burned Beatles records and merchandise in public, Lennon got death threats, and people were told to skip the band's upcoming tour. Lennon apologized, not for his beliefs, but for how his words had been misunderstood. The damage was already done, and it made Lennon more careful about what he said and who listened. But perhaps the most telling thing about Lennon's personal struggles came from him himself, not from critics or the press. In an interview with Playboy in 1980, just a few months before he died, Lennon did something that many artists would never do in public. He talked about his past behavior in very painful detail. Lennon admitted that he used to be mean to his wife and physically abuse her. He saw this as a shameful part of his past that he had worked hard to unlearn. By the time he made this admission, Lennon had spent years in therapy, meditation, and self-reflection, but he knew the truth about who he had been and didn't try to hide it. For a man who is often seen as a peace icon, this was a reminder that even the most admired people have dark sides that come through in the news. John Lennon was still trying to figure out how to live without hurting others or himself. He had found love and fatherhood, but peace was still hard to come by. Just when it looked like he was finally settling into something softer and more real, the tragic assassination happened. By December 1980, John Lennon had stepped back from the chaos of the spotlight and slowly returned to public life, releasing new music with Yoko Ono and becoming a dad to their young son Sean. Was living a quieter life in New York City in the Dakota, a grand Gothic-style apartment building with a view of Central Park. But this peace for John Lennon would be heartbreakingly short-lived. On the evening of December 8, 1980, Lennon and Yoko Ono were walking home from a long day at the recording studio. It was a routine walk into the entrance of the Dakota, one they had taken many times before. Just hours earlier, a young man had approached Lennon outside the same building holding a copy of Double Fantasy. Fantasy, Lennon's new album. Lennon paused and signed it, as he often did with fans. There are pictures from that moment in which Lennon looks calm, kind, and even happy. He had no idea that he had just signed an album for the man who would kill him. That man was Mark David Chapman, a 25-year-old from Hawaii who used to be a Beatles fan but had grown obsessed with what he saw as Lennon's hypocrisy and started to wonder how a man who preached peace and unity could live a rich and privileged life. Chapman's mind was becoming more unstable, and he started to see Lennon as a symbol of everything wrong in the world. He planned the murder for months. Chapman had flown to New York days earlier with a gun and a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, a book he said influenced his crazy thinking. He thought that by killing Lennon, he would make a statement that would make him like the book's main character Holden Caulfield. Chapman wasn't just going after Lennon because he thought he was wronging everyone, but as Lennon and Ono walked past him into the Dakota, Chapman pulled out his gun and fired at Lennon's back. 4 of the bullets hit him in the shoulder and back, and Lennon collapsed on the steps while Ono screamed. The most bizarre thing about the tragic event was that Chapman didn't run away, he just stood there, took out The Catcher in the Rye, and started reading. As if nothing had happened, Lennon was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital in a police cruiser because there wasn't time to wait for an ambulance. The officers who carried him said he wasn't responding, and medical staff tried to revive him but the injuries were too bad. John Lennon was pronounced dead soon after, and he was only 40 years old. The news shocked people all over the world, and people gathered outside the Dakota to light candles, sing songs, and cry openly. They couldn't believe it was the man who had. John Lennon, who had given up fame to live a life based on love and art, was killed in front of his home by fans. It was more than just the death of a musician, it was the silence of a voice that had shaped a whole generation. Lennon had spoken out against the world's wars, violence, and narrow-mindedness, but in the end he became another victim of the violence he had spent his life speaking out against. Chapman was arrested at the scene and later pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Since then, he has been in prison and has been denied parole many times. He has said he is sorry, but for many, the pain of Lennon's death has never fully healed. In the days that followed, Yoko Ono decided not to hold a public funeral. Instead, she asked fans all over the world to hold a 10-minute moment of silence. On December 14, 1980, tens of thousands of people gathered in Central Park with their heads bowed in a tribute that didn't need words. John Lennon's death wasn't just an act of violence. Violence marked the end of an era for people who grew up with the Beatles and believed in Lennon's message of change through music. It seemed like history had gone in the wrong direction. He had flaws, but he had tried to be better, to challenge systems, to love more deeply, and to live more honestly. In the end, he was killed by a stranger with a reason that no one could fully understand. But what if this terrible public tragedy wasn't as unexpected as we all thought? What if someone had seen it coming? Someone who had been with Lennon through every storm had warned him long before that December night. Yoko Ono confirms that she warned Lennon that he was in a creepy kind of danger in the months before he was killed. Yoko Ono, who had always been very intuitive and aware of the energies around them, later admitted that she started to feel that something wasn't right. These weren't just fears, some were based on real messages she had received, others on patterns that had. At the time, Lennon had just recently come back to the public eye after 5 years of self-imposed silence. From 1975 to 1980, he stopped making music completely and became a full-time father, rarely leaving New York. When he came back with the album Double Fantasy, it wasn't just a musical comeback, it was also a move back into the spotlight, a place Lennon had never fully trusted. Yoko Ono reportedly started getting warnings from acquaintances and friends in their spiritual circle. Some came from spiritual advisors who had been close to the couple for years, and Ono was told more than once that danger was close and that John should think about leaving New York for a while. Ono listened, and in the summer of 1980, she urged Lennon to take a trip to Bermuda by himself. It was a gentle push to get him away from the city and the energy that was starting to feel more unstable. Lennon agreed, and he sailed to Bermuda on a small yacht. The trip was rough, but he arrived safely and spent time writing songs, reflecting, and getting in touch with his creative side. He later described the Bermuda ride as a deeply non-secular revel in, and some of the songs on Double Fantasy were written throughout this quiet breakout. However, whilst it got here time to go back to New York, Lennon refused to stay away. To him the city represented freedom. He had fought tough to be allowed to remain inside the USA, mainly throughout the deportation struggle of the 70s. The Big Apple had embraced him as one of its very own, and Lennon frequently stated it changed into the primary vicinity. He felt loose to walk the streets like all people else. The concept of leaving completely or even dwelling in worry did not sit properly with him. While Ono relayed the warnings again, Lennon brushed off them. She later found out that she had shared the predictions directly with him. One unique message had been clean: Lennon become in chance, and something horrible should occur if he remained in his modern-day routine. Ono entreated caution, but Lennon's reaction changed into firm and almost resigned, consistent with Ono. He insisted that if something changed into going to manifest it would. You notice Lennon had lived together with her for years. From the time of the Beatles' rise, Lennon had received infinite demise threats after his 1966 comment approximately being greater popular than Jesus. There had been radio bans, protests and public burnings of Beatles information. The FBI monitored him for years because of his anti-warfare activism, and he had lengthy lived with the knowledge that his outspokenness got here with a price. Ono but noticed something distinctive this time. She believed the power was turning into greater ominous. However, Lennon saved. Shifting forward, he back from Bermuda, revitalized and eager to complete his new album, and regardless of her misgivings, Ono stood beside him, supported the undertaking, and again with him to the Dakota they resumed their day-by-day lifestyles. Lennon often walked the streets without bodyguards. He visited nearby cafes. He greeted enthusiasts outdoor the condominium, and one of those fans might sooner or later be Mark David Chapman. Looking back, the warnings feel devastating for Ono. They have been never indistinct hunches, they have been in reality deeply troubling particular messages, and she had carried out what she should to behave on them. However, Lennon made his desire. He refused to live in worry. He believed that art and honesty have been really worth the threat, despite the fact that it got here at a high personal cost. After the tragedy and Ono's revelation of the warnings, many might begin wondering whether something could have honestly changed the path of occasions. However, whilst the world mourned and the headlines diminished not the entirety, introduced up the instances surrounding Lennon's homicide and the occasions that followed, left behind a path of unanswered questions that have been too extraordinary to disregard. Many have asked how someone like Chapman, who had proven signs and symptoms of obsession and instability, was able to get so near Lennon. Why become there no safety at the Dakota that nighttime? Why had been the sooner non-secular warnings no longer taken greater significantly, and most of all changed into their any manner it could were prevented? Although Yoko Ono has confessed that she attempted her best to ward off the tragedy, her intuition, as sturdy as it had continually been, had additionally left her with a deep experience of inevitability that she had hoped would by no means emerge as reality. Lennon's legacy lives on in track, in activism, in artwork, and inside the ongoing conversations about what his existence and demise simply intended. But for Yoko and for those who cherished him, one question nonetheless lingers: may want to it have all been prevented? What do you watched? Was Lennon's loss of life inevitable, or could history have been rewritten? Inform us in the remarks section beneath. In case you enjoyed this video, bear in mind to click on the following video for your display like this video, and join our channel for extra updates.